1800s, we're talking post-Civil War. Picnic groves were a happening thing all across the country, and the town of Agawam, Massachusetts was no exception. They had an absolute secluded beauty known as Gallup's Grove. Situated on the Connecticut River, the main way to reach this place was by steamship. Towards the end of the 19th century, the park was renamed to Riverside Grove. Now, as the world entered the 20th century, the park began adding some early concept amusement park rides such as a carousel and whatnot, and the park grew and grew and grew in popularity. And it existed that way for almost a half a century. And then one day in 1911, a fellow by the name of Henry J. Perkins came along and instantly envisioned this place as an amusement park. Mr. Perkins made an offer on the land, it was accepted, and he immediately renamed his property Riverside Park. And the following year, the park's very first main attraction opened, a roller coaster named the Giant Dip. And Riverside Park was off and running. And 4 years later, Mr. Perkins added another roller coaster called Greyhound, designed by the legendary John A. Miller. 5 years later, the park removed the Giant Dip coaster. That was to make way for something bigger and better, and Mr. Miller was hired yet again to build another wooden roller coaster called Lightning. The 1920s were a banging time in the country's history. Everyone was fat and happy, and Riverside Park was doing banging business. And right before the decade came to a close in 1928, they added another roller coaster, Whirlwind Racer. So with everything looking fine and dandy and the park on cruise control and doing booming business, then the infamous stock market crash of 1929 happened. And shortly after that, the country entered the Great Depression. And in 1931, the park went into foreclosure. The following year, 1932, Mr. Perkins tried so hard to hang on financially. The park was open, but only on a limited basis for the remainder of the year. And the following year, Mr. Perkins lost his property, and Riverside Park was officially closed. And it sat that way for 6 years until 1939, when a dashing fella by the name of Edward Carroll came along. He saw great potential in this abandoned theme park. He purchased the property, made all necessary repairs, and got it ready to go, and in the following year, Riverside Park reopened to the general public. In 1941, Mr. Carroll purchased a roller coaster from Fantasy Forest in Flushing, New York, called Cyclone, and he opened it up at his park under the name Thunderbolt. And that bad son of a is still in operation today. Very cool stuff. Now, apparently Edward Carroll was a huge racing fan, and in 1948 he built his own racetrack, sitting adjacent next to the park called Riverside Park Speedway. About a decade later, in 1957, the park opened a new roller coaster, Wild Mouse. Now, the unusual thing about this coaster is it was removed, but the date of its removal is unknown. 2 years later, in 1959, the park added a monorail, appropriately named Monorail. The park sat pretty quiet for about 10 years until 1968 the park added a new roller coaster, Wildcat, manufactured by my guy Anton Schwarzkopf. In 1973 the park added two new attractions. First up, the New England Skyway, a gondola ride taking guests from one end of the park to the other. Now this one was really unique compared to most rides of its type. As opposed to traditional chairlift type seating, you sat in a round shaped cage, super unique looking. And the other attraction was the Rotor, manufactured by Chance. By 1976, NASCAR took notice of the Riverside Park Speedway and began hosting events there. The following year, the park added an aerodynamics launched loop coaster known as Loop Coaster, and that name sucked so bad, they quickly renamed it Black Widow. To close out the 1970s, in 1979, we saw the addition of Poland Springs Plunge, a log flume manufactured by Revershan. The 1980s was an incredibly quiet decade for the park. Really only three significant things happened. First up, in 1983, we got the removal of the Wildcat and it was scrapped, but we got the addition of a PTC wooden gem known as Cyclone. And 4 years later, in 1987, we got the addition of Colossus, a 150-foot tall Ferris wheel doubling as an observation attraction, manufactured by my guys at Vekoma. Jumping into the next decade in 1994, it was announced that Lady Luck Gaming and the Carroll family had agreed to open an on-site hotel and casino. The plans were drawn up and everything was good to go, but at the last second, the city of Agawam rejected it, and it never happened. So I don't know what the financial end of that was for the Carroll family, but my theory is there was probably a connection in the thing that happened next, as they sold Riverside Park to Premier Parks, and they officially renamed it Riverside The Great Escape for the 1996 season, and they removed the monorail instantly, and added an E&F Industries family coaster known as The Great Chase. The following year, in 1997, Premier Parks decided to invest heavily into the park, and they added Island Kingdom Water Park, and a bunch of new attractions on the theme park side. A Chance Chaos model known as Chaos, an Intamin Shoot-the-Chutes known as Shipwreck Falls, a bad Vekoma Ranger known as Time Warp, a Huss Top Spin known as Twister, and most notably a Vekoma SLC known as Mind Eraser. In 1998, the theme park world got hit with a bomb, as Premier Parks purchased all the Six Flags properties from Time Warner. And attraction-wise, the park added an S&S Turbo drop tower known as Hellevator. Now the following 2 years, all kinds of went down. First, we had the removal of the Riverside Park Speedway, and that opened up a huge plot of land, and the Island Kingdom Water Park doubled in size. And again, an influx of new attractions. First up, we had a Chance Inverter known as Double Trouble, a Hopkins Rapids attraction known as Blizzard River, a Vekoma Madhouse known as Houdini the Great Escape, and a Huss Frisbee known as Tomahawk. We also saw the removal of the Rotor and the Black Widow roller coaster that year. And Black Widow was sold to Old Indiana Fun and Water Park, where it operated there until 1996, where it closed down for good along with that park. As we entered the new millennium, it was fitting that we entered a new era in the park's history, as Riverside Park, the name, was no more, and moving forward, the park was referred to as Six Flags New England. And yet again, we got a slew of new attractions. First up, 2 towers were added to the Hellevator structure, and that was now a combo tower, and was renamed Scream. A Zaire Tivoli model known as Poison Ivy's Tangled Train. A Vekoma Boomerang known as Flashback coming over from Kentucky Kingdom, where it operated as Vampire. Clearly the most important news that year was the birth of a legend. Superman Ride of Steel, a 221-foot tall Intamin hypercoaster, an instant legend in the industry, still regarded as one of the best steel coasters ever constructed. 2 years later, the park opened Batman the Dark Knight, a 117-foot tall B&M floorless coaster. The B&M floorless, always a solid addition. In 2003, the Island Kingdom Water Park was closed, rebranded, and reopened as a generalized version of a Six Flags water park, known as Hurricane Harbor. 2 years later, in 2005, the park received a Gerstlauer spinning coaster known as Mr. Six's Pandemonium. We also saw 3 removals that year, as we've said goodbye to the Poland Springs Plunge, Colossus, and Chaos. The following year, we got 2 new additions, a spinning raft ride called Splashwater Falls, and the super rare S&S Sky SWAT, this version known as Catapult. 2007, we had a couple of renames and a removal, as Poison Ivy's Tangled Train was renamed to Catwoman's Whip, and Mr. Six's Pandemonium was simply referred to moving forward as Pandemonium. And we saw the removal of the Double Trouble. Now, in 2008, it was announced that Six Flags New England would be getting that indoor wild mouse coaster known as the Dark Knight, which a couple other Six Flags parks at the time received. So to avoid confusion, their B&M floorless known as Batman the Dark Knight was briefly renamed to Batman the Ride, because that's smart, there's not a quadrillion Batman the Rides in the chain. So for whatever reason, the indoor ride Dark Knight planned construction was canceled, and the floorless coaster reverted back to its original name, Batman the Dark Knight. Also that year, we saw the removal of Time Warp. The following year, in 2009, Superman the Ride of Steel was renamed and rethemed to Bizarro. By 2010, the country was in a financial mess, and Six Flags was no exception, and the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which they successfully emerged from the following year. In 2011, the park received a Mauer Wild Mouse coaster known as Gotham City Gauntlet Escape from Arkham Asylum. Oh my, that ride coming over from Kentucky Kingdom, where it operated as Roadrunner Express. And also that year, we had the removal of Shipwreck Falls. In 2012, the park received a Vekoma giant inverted boomerang known as Goliath, standing 177 feet tall, plagued with mechanical issues, coming over from Six Flags Magic Mountain, where it operated as Deja Vu. And speaking of mechanical issues, by the end of that year, we saw the removal of Catapult. In the following year, a removal of another flat ride in the park, as we said farewell to Twister. In 2014, the park was breaking records as it added a 400-foot tall Funtime Star Flyer known as the New England Sky Screamer, and upon its opening was the tallest of its kind in the world. Also in 2014, we saw the removal of the New England Skyway and the closure of Cyclone, but That was to get the RMC treatment, and it reopened the following year as Wicked Cyclone, and it is often regarded as one of the best smaller compact RMCs out there. 2016 we saw Bizarro renamed to Superman The Ride, and the removal of Splash Waterfalls. The following year in 2017 we saw Mind Eraser get renamed to Riddler Revenge, and the addition of an SNS 4D coaster in Joker. The following year in 2018, the park added Harley Quinn Spinsanity, a Zamperla giant discovery standing 149 feet tall. These rides might be my favorite flat rides out there. So much fun. In 2019, the park added Cyborg Hyperdrive, an enclosed Chance Trabant. In that year, we also saw the removal of that monstrosity Goliath. And in 2021, the park received one of those second-generation enterprises known as the Zamperla Endeavor, and this version is called Supergirl Skyflyer. Six Flags New England has one of the most underrated flat ride collections out there. It's a solid park top to bottom. Now, is it one of the top-of-the-line Six Flags parks? No. Is it one of the bottom-of-the-barrel Six Flags parks? No. I've often considered Six Flags New England kind of the upper middle class of the Six Flags chain, if you will. It's a solid Six Flags property and is quite possibly, very arguably, the best theme park in the Northeastern United States.